Ahoy everybody, I'm Endymion for the Dark at Arms, etc., and I'm going to take this time to do something a little unusual. I'm going to respond to a video made a while ago, looks like 10 months ago, by Sage, or at Rapier Sage, self-described creator, medieval enthusiast, artist. I cannot disagree with those descriptions. They are an SCA fencer, and they have a video called Footwork Foundations for SCA Fencing. So I'd like to add to this conversation by giving my own input that nobody asked for, speaking as a beginner who would like to join the SCA and is currently involved in HEMA fencing. So I'm going to start by talking about rapier footwork. And I do have a few disagreements on technique with Sage. First and foremost is to keep the feet... Let me adjust the microphone real quick. First being to keep the feet in line. The reason we do this is that when we are in the lunge, it's a lot easier for me to maintain balance curling my hips in order to do this. Whereas if I'm out, I'm squaring myself up. And in doing so, it makes it way more difficult if I'm keeping my body in profile. It sets me off balance a little bit. It makes it easier for someone to put me off balance even further. And I realize you can't see that front foot. Let me just angle it back, and then I'm going to step back a bit. Still can't see it, but you can see that my back heel is kind of out of line. And even if I'm throwing myself in profile, it doesn't feel as stable as if they were a solid line. And now I can pretty much rest here, curling in my hips and everything. The reason we do this in HEMA is because all of the writers talked about doing this. Literally, like, in Destreza, you keep it about single pace apart, you're pretty upright, you're here, you're making small actions, transverse steps, all that jazz. In the Italian school, you're still maintaining roughly 2 pace lengths. In other words, 2 spaces of your own sword foot, your own leading foot, determines how wide your stance should be. We're about here. The sword is parallel to the ground, the arm is parallel to the ground. Tip of the sword to my elbow or tip of the sword to my shoulder form an unbroken line, which makes it easier to channel my force through the sword and into my opponent. So this is about martial conduct. One of the other things to think about is when it comes to that force, Sage at first in the video sort of angles the hand upward, and it's a lot easier to see if I take off the glove. And Sage is not wearing gloves. What they do is they're angling the hand upward and breaking the wrist. Anyone who is familiar with sports medicine or anything will be familiar with the fact that this, and I can feel it already, this is overextending the tendons in my wrist. So I want to keep it at the apex of my reach, which is shoulder height. And this is a basic fundamental principle that all of the masters write about, which is the shoulder being the apex of your reach, which is why when you thrust, it should be at shoulder height, not to cheek height, not to chest level. If you're going to chest level, you're probably also dropping the point in order to cover the low line. If you're going to the cheek level, you are probably closing out the high line as you are dealing in a fully committed lunge to the opponent. And you do lean forward in Capoferro and in Fabris. So at least 2 writers that I have read, you do lean forward at the hips to get all the better reach and put all the more force into your thrust. Now, the SCA is all about safe and courteous fencing, and that is something that I would like to see more of in HEMA. But in HEMA, we are talking about martial fencing. We are talking about getting at least 3 inches of bend into the opponent, and this actually comes from the classical tradition, classical being foil, epee, and saber before they were electrified. The big writer on that would be William Gogler, I believe. Yeah. William S. Gogler? I have a copy of his book. But one of the other things to talk about, let me just check my script. Real quick. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Right. I mentioned briefly that if I'm offline with my feet, it's a lot harder to present in profile and it squares me up a lot more. The reason we don't want to square up, I gotta lower myself to be in camera. The reason we don't want to square up for rapier specifically is because this is a thrusting weapon. And we're very often, this is gonna look weird, but we are very often presenting this. It's a very small target. Notice it's just the single column of my chest, my hip, my knee. I just realized my form was bad because my knee was going like this. And our arm and shoulder. And notice that you can't see my arm really behind my guard up until everything past the elbow. Again, we want to keep that unbroken line from tip to elbow. Now, what was I just talking about? Yeah. We want to present as little target as possible, so that's why we go into this side profile thing. But breaking the wrist, which I mentioned earlier, this is going to be a bit of a ramble, does have its purposes. If, for instance, you have someone who really likes keeping their hand forward, like they're a destreza fencer, you can absolutely break the wrist, break your own wrist, as it were, break the relationship between your wrist and the point, and actually do what's called a stop thrust. This is, I believe, the terminology from Gogler, which is to say a thrust by angulation onto the opponent's elbow, forearm, or bicep, or back of the hand. This is to say the advanced target rather than your main targets of torso, neck, and head. You can absolutely do that. The French really love doing that. You'll see a lot of French small sword that's angled down like this. But, again, don't do that often. That should not be your standard for your basic direct thrust. Check my script again. Okay, Sage also went over some odd steps that I want to talk about. And this is where staying in profile and keeping the feet in line can become a little more controversial, as it were. I'm going to set this down. And that is the cross step. Sage proposes that if we are out of line, it makes it easier to bring our feet into the cross step. Let me do this in profile. And that's basically your cross step advance, and then your cross step retreat. It's pretty simple. I have been doing my heels in line as a sport fencer, classical fencer, rapier, and longsword fencer. Excuse me, I actually don't do that for longsword. That's bad for longsword, and I will explain why. I have been keeping my feet in line, and my heel comes back in line with my toes, so that if necessary, I can either use this foot as a spring to go into a crossed lunge, which does appear in Fabris, by the way. Salvator Fabris, Fabrice, however you say it. But I can also just do my normal advance and retreat with that cross step. It can make it easier, I would say, for beginners, sure, but once you're actually going into tournaments, there's a reason we call this inline fencing. There's a reason rapier is described as an inline weapon, similar to saber. Now, the two other odd steps that Sage mentions are you don't, excuse me, let me back up a little bit. You don't turn the foot out and you don't bring your feet together. Yes, you do. You do if you want to gather. The key is to keep your knees bent. Now, why would you want to bring the feet together? Well, think about it like this. If we're playing, we're out, we're just in measure, just barely in measure. I haven't really advanced, but I have. My back foot is now prepped to go into my lunge, or otherwise, I can sort of sneak into measure and take the opponent. Now, notice I turn the foot out like this. Put it back here, here. I'll go back even further, here. If we are doing destreza, we are always keeping our front foot pointed at the opponent. We are always keeping our dominant foot pointed at the opponent. Simple as that. We stay on target and we follow the opponent. We follow our front foot aimed at the opponent. Does that make sense? The reason we do that is for aim and for keeping our bodies in profile. To aim our sword at them, and so that if they really want to hit us, we are going to aim, snap. Can't really see it all that much, but I'm going to do a future video on an introduction to Destreza. But the turn out step is actually very important for Longsword. And this is where Sage does have a point about keeping the feet together versus keeping them apart. If you are in a German longsword setting, everyone is going to be wrestling once they get into a narrow measure. You have this measure where you are fencing each other. You're doing krumps, you're doing shield, you're doing all your zwerks and everything. But if you are apart and squared up, and I want to swing here, well, now suddenly I can do what baseball players do, and I turn out my hips by turning out my feet. I'll go here. Let's say whoop, shit, forgot about the light. If I want to give a Zorn or a diagonal descending cut from my left side, I'm going to turn out my heels. But I'm pivoting on the balls of my toes or on the center of my feet in order to get my hips into the action. This puts my center of mass behind the sword in motion and puts a lot more force and power into my cut. And I can do this with either foot leading, and I can do this while retreating, and I can still do the gathering step. This is something that I don't know if there's a particular master of defense that at Rapier Sage or just Sage is working with, but I would recommend talking to different masters of defense in the SCA or mods about the gathering step and about sneakily taking measure, because that's what the gathering step can do for you, especially in Rapier, because measure determines space and measure determines pretty much everything. Now, what else was I going to say? What else? Personal notes regarding Sage's video. I like it. I think it's a good introduction to people in the SCA. I think it's a good... it doesn't really explain where the conduct leaves the... Excuse me for just 1 second. Sorry about that. It doesn't explain that the SCA as basically LARP with steel. It doesn't explain that it is a game made for fun, not for historicity. It is not an association, and it is not a game based on actual historical techniques. It does pull from those techniques, but it is not a one-to-one. I would argue that HEMA can't be a one-to-one, but the SCA specifically has an ethos of safety first and safe conduct rather than martial conduct. And this is not to say that there aren't good, historically based, historically knowledgeable fencers in the SCA, but the rule set is not made to foster historical conduct, at least not where I am in the Kingdom of the West. That being said, this is also coming from someone who is not technically in the SCA. I've not been authorized. Also only about 2 years into my sword journey, only about 2 years on Rapier and about 1 year on Longsword. I've been reading for a while. I've been on YouTube watching people for a while, and I've got to say there are some people who are more historical than others. Believe Bjorn Ruther is his name? Great channel. Absolutely fantastic. Very, very good. Exact ethos that HEMA should bring to the table and everything. Excellent technique. Great teaching tools. But the SCA runs on the rule of lightest touch for everything, for Rapier and for cut and thrust rule sets. Not rattan, thank God. But also HEMA doesn't have very good rule sets many of the times either. The best that I can think of is SoCal, which is coming up pretty soon at the time of recording. SoCal's wound versus kill system, but even then, that's not great. It's still a game. It's still something that people can conduct themselves unmartially and ahistorically, and they will not lose. You can still play the game and win, but you don't have to be historical in order to win the game. That's my problem. But I think that Sage's video is excellent. I think that the video quality is marvelous. I just have some technical disagreements based on what I have been taught and read. So, knowing all this, take it with a grain of salt. I'm going to put a link to their channel and their video. So, yeah, I'm Endymion for the Dork at Arms, etc. I hope you like this little unusual video. I'll probably redo this in a couple of years once I get a better camera or a better setting where I'm not locked inside or whatever. But yeah, I'm Endymion for the Dork at Arms, etc. Subscribe if you want more, like if you like this, and leave a comment or critique below in the comment section. Thank you.